So, let me tell you a little story. There's something different between me and my wife. She likes to, I'm not sure how much she likes it, but she does watch some of those little videos and programs where, they tell you like all sorts of horrible things that happen to so-and-so, and it's heartbreak, and then you watch and you cry, and, you're feeling really bad. And she gets her mom ringing you and saying, I've seen this, and, it tells her this heartbreaking story. And then Yuli needs to go and watch that, and then she cries, and then she talks to me, and I'm like, no, I don't want to listen to this. I can watch a comedy, but that's as far as it goes. So I'm probably, she's better than me. And here's the thing, there was this news, I saw it on the news a couple of times this week, I read the news, I don't watch the news, okay? And there was this thing, this little boy, I think it was in Australia. Oh, you know what it is about, right? Okay, do you want to tell the story? So, because you've seen it, that's great.
So there's this little 9-year-old Aboriginal boy in Australia who has the most common form of dwarfism. And he's had a series of incidents at his school where his mom's had to come and pick him up due to bullying. And so she kind of had her final straw moment when she picked him up, and he was crying and going on about how much it was affecting him and that he didn't want to live anymore because all of the bullying was happening. So his mom posted this video just saying, this is what happens when you don't educate your children or your friends and family, and you just allow this to go on, and this is what our life is like, and I don't know what to do anymore. And ever since she posted that video, it went viral, and tons of celebrities and sports teams around the world have just rallied around this little boy. I think over this past weekend, the Aboriginal rugby team in Australia walked on with him. So that's all I know.
Okay, cool, thank you. So I was, I read about this, but I was I didn't click on the video. And then my wife was watching it on Facebook, and she was like crying for half an hour and sobbing. And I was like, what's going on? She's like, just watch this. And I was like, no, I'll cry this way, don't do that. But joking apart, that was a very sad video, right? Because you see this little boy crying in total, hysterically crying, really, and his mom saying that he wants to commit a suicide, and he's 9. And you think about what causes that. The plain bullying. Now, here's the thing, what do we do about this when we see things like this? Because the thing, the troubling thing is that kind of story is a very common story, isn't it? Bullying is just happening all the time. I'm thinking of my school years, and there was a boy in our class that all the rest of the guys, most of them, were really bullying him, and people kind of didn't even think much about it. And I remember myself, we were kind of, it's a joke, it's not a big deal. I wasn't part of that group, but I never did anything to stop that, because we kind of all thought, it's a joke. Well, it wasn't. So when we see this kind of, evil things around us, what do we do? Because we have quite a disturbing little passage when Jesus talks about saying, do not resist an evil person. How does that work in real life? So what should we be as a church when we encounter evil in life? You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. That doesn't look good, huh? So think about it. You see this little boy, and instead of going and keeping a couple of little butts there, right? You just say, come on, guys, keep doing it. That's okay. And then you turn to this little boy and says, you know what? That's okay. That's not a big deal. It's just a bit of bullying. What kind of teaching is this? And what do we make of that? Or do we say, well, no, it's not real. Well, let's shelf it and let's move away from it. But here's the thing. Now, if you look at what Jesus did, how did he deal with evil in his life? What did he make of it? What did he do about it? Well, interestingly, he didn't took the position of a doormat and says, you know what, just that's okay. In the afterlife, you'll be rewarded. Right? He didn't say that. He didn't do that. He didn't tolerate it himself. Well, actually, he would stand against that sort of evil and challenge that and say, well, that wouldn't work. We talked about giving today, right? And that's a subject that's often abused in churches. And you'll see a lot of churches where, this is a very high on the agenda. It's all about extracting money from the parishioners. And interestingly, Jesus talks about this. And there's this famous story where, that poor widow's offering that very often is used as an example of how people should give. But interestingly, if you read that story, that's not an example how you should give, but that's an example how you shouldn't give. Because Jesus, in the previous verse, he challenges the Pharisees. He says, look, guys, you get in reach on the backs of poor people, on the houses of, you devouring the houses of the widows, and you get in everything from them. And then he sees that old little woman who brings that last penny she had and said, well, look at her. She's given everything. Is this really what you expect? Is this what you should do? Or should you be helping her? So he stood up against the injustice. He didn't tolerate that. So what should we do? How should we reconcile his teaching on not resisting an evil person to living a life that we at least feel good about ourselves and not feeling like I feel now when I'm thinking about my classmate who, I didn't say anything against that bullying exercise. And, well, the thing is, and now it's not me being the Greek scholar, okay? I hate quoting Greek, and I'm not a big specialist in that myself, but this is apparently the problem here. So, the evil person, well, the word evil in Greek can mean either evil person or by evil means. It's a synonym. And so, just like Jesus is saying, if somebody, do not resist an evil person, it can actually mean, and most likely it means, do not resist someone by evil means. Do not resist someone with violence. And the reason it's more likely translation here is because of what comes next. How Jesus actually tells us what we should do. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Why is that important here? What is he saying that you just need to, tolerate an injustice that is done to you? Well, essentially, Jesus is saying, well, the only way people could strike you was on the right cheek, right? The left hand was unclean, so you couldn't touch people with that. So that was the way to insult somebody, to strike somebody on the right cheek. So when Jesus is saying, turn to him the other also, in other words, he's saying, well, if somebody strikes you trying to humiliate you, trying to treat you as inferior person to them, challenge them, turn to them the other cheek of dignity and say, well, you're not humiliating me, you're humiliating yourself. Challenge that behavior, but do it non-violently. He talks about, if somebody sues you and takes your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Think about that situation and why somebody's trying to take your tunic and not your cloak. Because if somebody wanted to sue you, the cloak would be probably more appropriate. Am I right? Because the cloak is your outerwear, whilst the tunic is your undergarment. And there's a simple reason for that. If you look into Deuteronomy, there's a law about giving loans to a poor person and taking something as a security for a loan. And it says if somebody is so poor that they want to borrow money and they give you their cloak as a security against the loan, there is something you should be doing. You should be returning them that cloak every night so that they could sleep in it, because that's the only thing they have. It's not just their cloak, it's their bedding as well. It's their blanket they cover themselves with. So you've got to show that bit of just being humane with them and give it back to them. They'll return it to you in the morning. But Jesus is offering here a very interesting situation when somebody's been so horrible that they're not breaking the law, they're not taking the cloak away from the person, but they're suing them to take the undergarment from them. And this is where Jesus is saying, how can you challenge that? So we'll give them the cloak as well. Stand naked in front of them, because that scandal of your nakedness will actually expose their unrighteous behavior, because what they're doing is a bigger scandal than for you to appear before them naked. And he keeps on with saying, if somebody asks you to go with them 1 mile, or if somebody forces you to go with them 1 mile, go with them 2. How do you see that? I'm just kind of picturing this. My wife wakes up in the morning. I'm like, hey, honey, I want to go for a walk. Would you go with me? She's like, no. Like, I'll twist your arm if you're not, right? And then she's like, okay, honey, okay, I'll go with you. I'll go with you, right? Is this how somebody's forcing you to walk for a mile? Do you force somebody to go with you a mile? Well, again, there was a cultural thing. A Roman officer could force any Israeli man to carry their burden. Well, their baggage, their bag, their suitcase, whatever they had, they could force them, they could order them to carry that for them for a mile. Now, that was a law, and that was a law partly to humiliate the Jews, to remind them they were enslaved by the Romans, and Romans, they had the authority and the power to enforce that on them. Now, what Jesus is saying, if somebody forces you to do that, rather than going behind their back and trying to spit at them, as they don't notice it, walk with them another mile. Surprise them by doing that. Because you were forced, you walked as a slave. Well, the second mile, you go as a free man. And that person will be puzzled and surprised by that, because they expect hostility, they expect hatred. Now, they will be positively surprised and maybe unpleasantly surprised, because they will recognize or realize that who they're talking to is a human being. Not a slave, not some despised Jew, but a real human, equal just like they. So what Jesus is saying here, he's saying don't tolerate the injustice, challenge that, but do that without violence. So something that we could see in that peaceful resistance, the civil rights movements and in various things around the world, something that really works, something that really makes a difference. So the little boy's story, or any other story like that, if anything, this passage is an invitation to challenge evil, to resist it, but don't resort to evil. Don't turn into the kind of person we want to fight or challenge. But the beauty of it is that it's not the end. Because Jesus doesn't just say, okay, well, there you go. Challenge that and leave it, right? Or fight it, win the fight, defeat them. He isn't saying that. But he continues on to talk about enemies. Now, talking about enemies, that's a very interesting subject. Because again, in churches, very often, we don't talk about it because we don't have enemies, do we? Well, if you kind of look deep into your heart, how many enemies can you name? Can anybody? Can you really talk about somebody that you would consider an enemy? Anybody wants to raise a hand? No? I've been thinking about it. There are people I dislike, but I don't think there are anybody who would I consider an enemy, in all honesty. And so when we read a passage that it says, love your neighbor, and you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I'm kind of thinking, well, that's not particularly relevant, isn't it? Unless we think of... In our church in Prague, we used to have an interesting tradition. Before the communion, there was a time of prayer, And then, people spend a bit of time walking around the church, greeting each other. And the way the greeting worked, it was always, people would shake hands or give a hug and says, "The peace of the Lord be with you." And it was interesting because some people liked it. Some people kind of felt a bit weird about it. When you say it for 50 times to, 50 different people in the same room, it kind of doesn't really, it washes away that meaningfulness of it. And I remember when we were sitting in a service, and the preacher was sort of saying, "Okay, this is what we're going to do next." And there were a couple of guys sitting behind me. I was like, "Oh, this handshaking again. Please no." And I kind of smiled first, and then I thought, well, what happens in our church when we need to shake hands and share peace or wish peace to one another? We may say that that's just handshaking, it doesn't mean much. But even if we take that very little circle of people, here, sometimes people feel different things about others. Sometimes people may have an unpleasant conversation and not feel particularly good about somebody. Sometimes people just assume that somebody else doesn't like them or treats them unfairly, and that kind of sours their relationships. It happens. Conflicts, they're inevitable. They happen in every family. They happen in every gathering of people, in every church, everywhere. So, how do we deal with that? Well, somebody say, well, that's not kind of the enemy, but hypothetically, that's our enemy. Somebody who you dislike, somebody that you feel bad about. What do you make of it? How do you deal with that? Well, if there is an injustice there, you can stand against that, and you can challenge that, and it works. And sometimes, it takes humility, and it takes an effort to put into that. I saw another little video. Nick Vucic. The guy that doesn't have arms or legs, and he goes around the world doing preaching, and there's lots of videos. So he was sharing that little story of when he was at school, there was a guy that insulted him all the time and made fun of him. And he said, I felt really, really bad about it, and I felt so humiliated by this. And he said, once I came to that guy and I said, you know what, could you stop it? And he was like, does it bother you? And he said, I kind of felt to say, no, it's not a big deal. But then he said, I had to step over my pride and actually be honest and say, yes, it does. It bothers me a lot. And the guy said, look, mate, I didn't mean it. Just a joke. Sorry, I won't do it again. And he never did. Sometimes it takes that challenge. It takes a step of faith. It takes a possibility of, being vulnerable and opening ourselves to somebody. And that's what we need to do, to challenge that. But what happens next? Jesus says, well, pray for them. Love these people. And he doesn't say, don't have enemies, because I guess that's impossible. We will feel bad about somebody. Somebody will, insult us. Somebody will do something unpleasant to us. So Jesus doesn't say, don't have enemies. But he says, love them. Win them by loving them. And it's not like, have that loving attitude to them. When you see somebody who is unpleasant to you, your heart should melt, right? Because, it's them again, right? Well, if you do that, they probably will sense that and will be even bigger enemies for you. But Jesus says, love them. Pray for them. Do good things to them. Reach out to them. Put that love into action. Make something nice. Now, one of the biggest, recent stories about that type of attitude of loving the enemy, of reaching out to an enemy and doing good to them. Remember there was this thing in the US recently when a police officer, she shot a guy in his own apartment. So the lady's name was Amber Guyder, and she killed Botham Jean in his own apartment because she thought it was hers. So she walked in and she shot him twice. She killed him there. even though he lived on a different floor. So she was put on trial for that, and she was, I think, given a 10-year sentence for it. But there was something extraordinary that happened in the courtroom. The family of the guy she killed, they stood up and said, we forgive you for what you've done. His brother, actually, he came and he hugged her and he said, I forgive you, and if you ask God, he will forgive you as well. We forgive you because we believe this is what God wants us to do. It was a very emotional scene that happened in court there, but you could see that Christian love, forgiveness, loving the enemy put into practice. And the family said, if we could, we would say we wouldn't even send you to prison for it. We'd forgive you completely. Now, when we see something like this, when we hear stories like this, we all may say, oh, this sounds really good. I admire these people, but I can't do it myself. I don't think I'm that good a Christian. I don't think I'm that spiritual. I don't think my faith is that mature. So I'm not really sure I can manage with that myself. By doing this, we're kind of excusing ourselves from, following the teaching of Jesus, because I recognize I'm a sinner, and that's kind of a good way out. But here's what Jesus is saying, right? He's not saying don't have enemies. He's saying love them. Do something for them. If you can't tolerate them, start praying for them. If you can't... Okay, well, here's the next question then. Well, even if I do, they don't change. Even if I've been doing all these good things to them, they still treat me badly. Even if I really love them and I put everything I can into loving them, they still don't change and don't respond nicely. So what's the point? Well, the point is, and again, Jesus puts this here very clearly. He says it's not about them. When you love somebody who is your enemy, when you love and not hate, when you do good things to people that you think may not deserve that, you're not doing it to change them. You're doing it to change yourself. Because he says what you need to be, what you need to look up to, is not somebody or winning some friends or making people like you better. What you need to be like your Father in heaven, who is perfect. Who is perfect not in the sense he's good and he never, he is. But talking about God, that's kind of pointless. It's redundant, right? But he's perfect in the sense he's got place in his heart for everyone. He can embrace everyone. And that's what Jesus wants us to be. He wants us to have that space in ourselves for others. He wants us to have that ability to love our enemies, to love people that we may not like, and maybe for good reasons. Because it's about us. It's about our heart. It's about our life. It's about us being made in the image of God. Whether it's going to change them or not, that's actually irrelevant. It's what my love to them does to me. And I think this is something, the teaching that Jesus offers here is challenging. It's not that easy. I'm not saying it's very easy to start loving somebody who's been really, horrible to you. It's not easy to start doing good things to people who you think don't deserve that because they've been really insulting and offensive. But what Jesus is saying, start loving them, because that will change your attitude. That will change your heart. And then everything they do, even if they persist in doing evil, that won't affect you, because you'll be way above that, because you will be like your Heavenly Father, who is perfect. Now, interestingly, we didn't talk with Suzanne about what I'm going to preach, so she just selected some hymns, and she said before the service, I hope it fits. But then it was very interesting for me that she started the service by a reading from Psalm 119. And that's the end of my sermon. I want to read a few verses from Psalm 119. So it does fit very well. Most likely what I said today, it's not new. People, you all know it. And, the teaching on the Sermon on the Mount is something very familiar. A lot of people outside of the church, they can probably quote these verses, even though they may not believe them. But just as we know the scripture, we know the struggle that accompanies us trying to be faithful to Jesus and his teaching. And so I thought, these words in Psalm 119, that is a good prayer to finish this reflection, on how we can remain and be more faithful to what Jesus wants us to do and to be. So it's from verse 33. I'm going to read a few verses. Teach me, O Lord, to follow your decrees, and then I will keep them to the end. Give me understanding, and I will keep your law and obey it with all my heart. Direct me in the path of your commands, for there I find delight. Turn my heart towards your statutes and not towards selfish gain. Turn my eyes away from worthless things. Preserve my life according to your word. Fulfill your promise to your servant so that you may be feared. Take away the disgrace I dread, for your laws are good. How long I for your precepts? Preserve my life in your righteousness. Amen.